Brought ECOLOGIA to us in Vermont in 2001 and has actively worked with Middlebury students, EIA, faculty, the Alliance for Civic Engagement, more than 100 students for local Vermont and international service learning projects. He's now consulting with both Middlebury and Monterey to bring the China program to a whole new level, which is very exciting. And he's arranged for Middlebury and Monterey to become the U.S. consortium partner with a network of European universities doing environmental studies work. Randy is so thoughtful, and we're going to learn a lot, so thank you for doing it.
It's a challenge talking to you because some of you are familiar with my thinking. Some of you have actually seen the diagram on the board, and some of you haven't. For those who've seen this diagram before, I can say that my thinking about it and on it has evolved a lot, and it's at a very interesting juncture, which I'll explain in a moment. For those of you who haven't, I'll try to explain it, and maybe those of you who've heard it before, hearing it for the second or third time, will have more probing questions. Let me just start by building on what John said, which is I moved my international not-for-profit, which I co-founded with my wife here in the year 2000 from northeastern Pennsylvania, a very rural region that looks very much like Vermont, but culturally certainly is not. And there were a variety of reasons. One is that my daughter had gone to Middlebury College and become very familiar with what it has to offer. And as a result of her being here and actually working for us after she graduated in our office in Russia, I began to recruit Middlebury students, and I found out that every time I got one, they were just enormously valuable assets for the organization, partly because of language skills, but partly because of the broad liberal arts background and the willingness to tackle almost anything we would throw at them. So it got to the point where if we wanted to continue to grow our organization, we either had to get Middlebury to move to rural northeastern Pennsylvania, or we had to move up here. And it turned out that we, obviously decided to move up here. So we occupied a little house in Frog Hollow, those little yellow houses across from the Storm Cafe at the time. And we weren't there very long when a Middlebury student knocked on our door and said that she had heard that we were doing some projects in China. Her name was Lila Buckley, and her name will come up many, many times during this presentation. Well, Lila basically was in her sophomore year, and she was planning on studying abroad in Beijing, and she wanted to do an internship. And this is going to sound strange to some of you, sort of a sad reminder to others, but 10 years ago, to try to do an internship when you were abroad was actually a really novel idea. It was more than novel, it was actually controversial. And in the case of going to China, you were actually discouraged from doing that kind of thing because it got you out of the classroom. You were supposed to be spending your time learning Chinese. But Lila was a very determined young woman. She did her internship, and we introduced her to an NGO in China that we had helped to found. At the time, this is also shocking to say this, there were 3 NGOs in China. 2 of them were government regulated, and 1 was totally independent. The totally independent one, I'm proud to say, got its first funding from our little organization in the United States as a result of a trip that co-founder made to the United States when she visited our office in northeastern Pennsylvania. So we kind of made the introduction for Lila, and Lila did a lot of research on this NGO, which was in the process of becoming a think tank. And when she went to Beijing, she immediately introduced herself, personally, but she had been doing it on email, and was really intrigued with the work that this NGO was doing. Unfortunately, this was the year of SARS, so I don't think Lila spent more than a few weeks, it might have been as much as a month, in China. She was evacuated, came back to the United States, and did her thesis research at a Chinese community in Montreal or something like that. But The nice part of the story is the contact she had made with the Beijing organization stuck, and after she graduated from Middlebury, she immediately went back to Beijing and reintroduced herself to what was then the Global Environmental Institute, the first environmental think tank in China, funded by a U.S. foundation, which had funded us. And within a year, she became the deputy director, at age 22, of this giant think tank in China, partly because of her language skills, partly because of sort of this Middlebury can-do attitude. And she remained the deputy director of Global Environmental Institute, I think, for 4 or 5 years. And this grew to be a very powerful, very significant organization in China. It still is today. It advises the government on a range of policies. Lila then left GEI and went back to school to learn advanced Chinese at Beijing University. After that, she applied to and matriculated at the Oxford University Environmental Change Institute, where she graduated about a year and a half ago at the very top of her class with honors. So that was an illustration of what this curve represents. And when I draw that curve, I think of people like Lila and some others that I'll talk about in a moment. So let me go from the concrete example of one sort of student internship that we helped to launch, to where this curve came from. Somebody shot my curve. I couldn't draw this on PowerPoint exactly as I wanted to, and the hand-drawn version of this is actually a series of dots. And what I meant to represent here was kind of 2 different approaches that are often taken in academia to internships and student projects abroad, including research. The red curve here is a learning curve. A learning curve obviously represents accumulating knowledge. Slowly, quickly, the slope of the curve indicates how fast it happens, and then whether the knowledge is held onto or whether we forget it. But what I'm trying to represent here is the experience I had working with Middlebury, but more importantly, observing other colleges and universities around the country and in Europe, where I have these affiliations John mentioned. And what typically happened 5-6 years ago, was that most students, unlike Lila, would start thinking about what they're going to do late in their sophomore year when they go abroad if they want to do an internship. They would be abroad, they'd have a very intense experience, and they would come home, and the experience wouldn't stick very long. And Tiffany can remember very well when we did a series of workshops for students coming back from study abroad, we kept hearing the same phrase from these students. And Meg Ryan, Meg Young said, I want to hold on to the experience, I don't want to lose it. And what she was saying was that she had an incredible experience in Africa, and she wanted to build on it, but she felt it slipping away. And we began a discussion with what was then the ACE office, and we've continued the discussion with the EIA about how to help students hold on to the experience of returning from abroad. It's very, very difficult. There aren't a lot of structures at the college, or any college for that matter, to facilitate and encourage that. Students do theses sometimes, but a lot of the experience just is rather quickly shed, and the learning is lost. So what we began working on with Lila and the others that I'll mention is trying to start earlier in the academic career, sometimes in the freshman year. And I know when you were looking at your center, you were even thinking going back as early as high school years, to begin to discuss with students what you might do for a project internationally, or for that matter domestically, and begin to lay the foundations. And if the PowerPoint presentation had cooperated a little more, this would have been a slower curve, rising more gently, but it came out the way it came out. So that the concept, the ideal for me at this point, in my career and working with students here and around the world is to try to get people thinking in their freshman year or early in their sophomore year what they want to do when in their junior year when they go abroad, or their junior year summer, or their sophomore summer, and to build a higher level of knowledge and to hold it. And I think that's the key part, is how do we hold on to the knowledge and the information, the personal insights, the professional skills that we developed abroad. And I'll talk about some of those ways in a moment. So what we have in this learning curve is an opportunity to build on the experience, hold it through your senior year, hold it through graduate school. Again, I would use Lila Buckley as an example, and then into your professional life. And if the curve had allowed me to do what I wanted to do, it would actually keep going up instead of back down. So this is a little bit abstract, but I developed it because when Ron Leibowitz or Sundar Ramaswamy at Monterey or my colleagues here would ask me, what is it you're trying to do? And I would start describing the 99 things we needed to do to help students hold on to the experience of having a productive and interesting and meaningful internship abroad. Their eyes would kind of glaze over because it was too much information. So this is the simplified version. And so in terms of words, what I'm looking at here, again, and I'm oversimplifying, but I'm trying to present this in a quick, brief way so we can talk about it. The conventional time frame that I have found prevailed, and used to prevail here, but we're quickly getting away from it, is that students would spend a few weeks and at most a few months preparing for a project abroad. I'll give you an egregious example in a moment on the next slide. And what they were preparing for was very often a brief, it could be 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks experience that was a one-off. They wouldn't ever be able to go back. They probably might not maintain contact. It was unsupervised in the sense that once they went out into the field, they lost contact with their mentors. And it focused primarily on project outcomes. And I'll give you another anecdote, the degree to which I think this is carried to excess. Some years ago, I attended a meeting on some international projects as Middlebury students often give in public. And the student actually bragged about being arrested twice in China on his summer project. And no one asked him about that. No one asked if that was appropriate. No one asked about the implications of that for the Chinese partner or for Middlebury and its programs abroad. But his presentation came off very well because he described his project as a success. When he talked to me afterward, one-on-one, he actually admitted that it was probably a failure. What he had done is he had used GIS coordinates to locate a polluting factory, and as a result of locating this on a river, he and his Chinese partner got the factory bulldozed to the ground. No due process, no warning to the factory, just bulldozed to the ground. And everybody thought that was really great when he presented it. In the private conversation, he told me, of course the factory owner knew it was going to be bulldozed and probably moved it the week before and had no implications whatsoever for reducing pollution. But it came off as the student told me, and I'm quoting him, in a Hollywoodized version of a success story, which is what he needed to tell. So what I learned from that presentation is that we very often emphasize project outcomes and success stories to the exclusion of learning experiences for the student, which I'll get back to in a moment. So there's an enormous pressure to succeed with projects, and this isn't just in Middlebury, I mean, this is everywhere around the world. It's hard to report back to your funders at school. It's hard to put in your portfolio, in your resume, that I did a project in China or Ecuador and it failed. It's just not the prevailing mode of operation. And as I said before, students often return with an unfulfilled desire to hold on to and integrate the experience. I think what we're learning at Middlebury and Monterey, and we've all been learning this together, and we're still struggling to figure out how to do it, is that a longer-term planning time frame really pays off. Investing months or years pays. An extended in the field experience, instead of like a 1 or 2 week, it can be a couple of months, or your entire study abroad, or your study abroad and then an internship, is a more valuable experience. And the opportunity to return to the project, to do it over, to go back and correct the mistakes that were made the first time, can be an important opportunity. I think what you're doing at the center here is trying to build in some projects that chance to do a pilot project and go back and do the main project. And what I learned this summer, I'll talk about in a moment, is the value of supervision and guidance on the ground during project implementation. I was on the phone on Skype with a Middlebury junior and a Monterey graduate student who were teamed up this summer. I would say every other night for about 2 weeks when they were in China. It was really hard work. It was tense. Sometimes the tensions became personal. But the learning curve was so much higher. The students got so much more out of it because I was there asking probing questions, which were sometimes not comfortable questions to ask. What we've also learned is that having learning objectives as well as project outcomes as the focus of the project makes a big difference. This is so obvious when we say it, and it was obvious that it was valuable when it was presented to me, but I never thought about it until some colleagues at Monterey said, we don't send students into the field without them indicating what they personally want to get out of it. For example, I want to learn how to work in an international not-for-profit. I want to learn how to develop a certain scientific environmental monitoring skill. And then it makes it easy to evaluate the project, even if the project failed, if the student acquired the skill and achieved the professional development objective. I think what we're getting comfortable with also is recognizing problems and failures and dealing with them up front as a natural part of the project. And again, as I said, holding on to the experience. So, what is the time frame on this?
We have till like 1:30.
Okay, I'm going to take 75 minutes, and then I really want to have a discussion instead of talking at you. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I just got this email very recently in September. It arrived on September 12th, and I locked out to protect the guilty the name of the person who sent it and the foundation that it came from. It's very nice, very well written. It's actually Monterey grad, it turns out. He's directing this program in China that's getting a lot of publicity. There's a lot of buzz surrounding it. So, if you read it, what she's basically saying is, hey, I'm taking 20 high school students on a tour in 9 days. Can you arrange for them to participate, in your organization's work in China? And I probably get 20 or 30 of these a year. Half of them actually come from Middlebury students. They say, I'm going abroad next week. I'd like to do a project. Can you recommend an organization? And the answer is always no, absolutely not. If you're not prepared, if you haven't put background work and invested time and energy in it, I really don't want you to talk to my partner on the ground. It's an imbalanced relationship. You're basically using them as kind of tourism where they spend a lot of money hosting you and your participants get to pay tuition to your organization to do it. But really nobody gets much of anything out of it other than building resumes. So as much as we're making enormous progress here at Middlebury, the prevailing model throughout the world, and I dare say it's becoming more of a prevailing model, is to set up for-profit companies that literally send thousands of students abroad every year and charge them anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 for one of these deals, where at the last minute they're plugged into sightseeing or sometimes doing something constructive like building trees or planting trees. But it really isn't beneficial, and it really doesn't develop a deep understanding, or the learning curve doesn't go very high, and it dissipates very, very quickly. So if I go back to the original slide, there's a couple more comments I'll make, and then we'll talk about it. one of the things that I feel makes the difference between the height of this curve and the height of this curve is time for reflection. My daughter went to Middlebury, as did my son-in-law, and it is she who taught me this, and forgive me for those of you who've heard this story many times, but it really is worth repeating, and I remind myself of it almost daily. In her sophomore year, she almost dropped out because of the intensity here. I don't need to tell either faculty or students that sometimes it's crushing. And in her sophomore year, two things happened. One is she went to do a J-term internship at the Institute for Northern Studies, which I don't even think it exists anymore. It was in the Northeast Kingdom, where they basically sat by a pond and watched ice grow for a day. And then after they watched the ice grow and drew diagrams and made notes in their journal, they spent about a week figuring out the dynamics of ice growth and what it means for the ecosystem. And she said, it was the first time I ever understood what scientists really do and why they're intrigued. It's a slow process. It's following your curiosity, and it has an aesthetic dimension to it. And then she said, I don't think I want to go back to the classroom at Middlebury. I just can't stand it anymore. And we did a very parental thing. He said, you're going back. We've invested a huge amount of money. You're going back. So she went back, but she said, I'm going back on my own terms. I'm going to take Wednesday afternoons or Thursday mornings off, and every other weekend, Aaron and I aren't going to study. We're going to go camping or skiing or something, and my grades are going to suffer horribly. And I thought, okay, that's a reasonable decision, taking control of your life. So her report card, came at the end of the year. We eventually saw it, and her grades, not only did they not go down, they went up. And she ended up graduating cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa and all that kind of stuff. And she actually rejected enormous pressure from her advisor to do a senior honors thesis, and the professor got furious at her for not doing it. But she took control of her life, and what she discovered was that taking time to reflect, to process the information that you were getting, but not just the information, the personal challenges, the professional development opportunities that lay before you, to think about those, not just to read under pressure and write and read and write and read, raise the level of learning enormously. So we tried in the work that we do at ECOLOGIA with Middlebury students, and the work I'm now doing with Middlebury and Monterey, to encourage people who develop research projects and internships to build in that reflection time, not just before and during the internship or research project, but my last point, after the research project. Last year we did a research project, prepared internships with Jeff Kent, who was at the Chinese school in China, and a Monterey student, and they wrote a glowing report about how successful their project was. And it looked really great. And they indeed produced a professional quality consulting report. And then about a month after they were back home, I bumped into Jeff, and he came to my office, and he said, I'm still thinking about the experience this summer. It was horrible. I said, wait, your report is glowing. He said, I know, it was really horrible. And I said, well, tell me about it. So we met 2 or 3 times, and he began to discuss all the personal dynamics of working with someone who had a different work ethic, and he had never had this experience before. And I said, Jeff, it looks like the learning is just beginning. And we met over the course of a year, and he met with another Middlebury student who had done an internship last summer several times to try to process what was going on. And they ultimately concluded that they learned more after they returned, reflecting on what they had done, than they had learned in the field. Because in the field, their performance had been scripted, and they were more or less projecting what they thought they should project, which is, everything's going fine, successful, we wrote this beautiful report, and they came home and they said, it was miserable, I would never want to do that again, I went back, I didn't want to do it that way. Which I thought was absolutely marvelous and very honest. So, whether you're an administrator, a student, a funder, I think there are really important lessons here to take away, which is just to take time, to take a breath, to plan what you want to do, to hold on, as my daughter did, to the vision of what you want to do and make it your own, not let others direct you over the cliff of stress. And then after you've had the experience to process it and make it part of your continuing education, not necessarily just your senior thesis, but your professional development and growth. And then this curve goes up, 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 and up. Let me come back to Lila. Lila, whom I haven't seen now for almost a decade, is coming back to Middlebury, found out last night, next week. So I'll get a chance to see her after 12 years. We're going to talk about her current work, which is the exact same work that my organization, ECOLOGIA, is doing, which is corporate social responsibility in China. So for Lila, the learning curve, is up here, and it's continuing a decade out. And Middlebury is finally coming to terms with the fact that it's an expensive education. The president just wrote this memo on August 23rd about adding the value proposition to the Middlebury education. And I feel that a Middlebury education is worth what we charge when we're giving people like Lila 12 years out guidance and professional development that builds on a relationship that we began back here. You're not paying 4 years of tuition, you're paying for truly lifelong learning. And I would encourage students to expect and demand that, and I guess challenge myself and my colleagues to see how we can fulfill that promise. So let me stop. So ask the hard questions, don't ask the easy ones, because I know there are concerns about this.
I'd love to get some student perspectives. What speaks to you guys about this?
I think the reflection piece is something that I connect with a lot. I went to semester school where reflection was a big part of our experience, and reflecting about what we had learned that week and having a chance to share that with other people. And it just gives, I feel like it gives time for each of us to think about what we did and how we can kind of do things better, or not do things better, or just kind of do it differently another time. And I think the time that you invest, it's like counterintuitive, because the time you invest might seem like it's taking away from like doing schoolwork or socializing or sleeping, is actually going to help benefit and maximize the amount of time that you have to do things after that. So it's something that I agree with and I connect with a lot. But it's also wondering how you can make the most of reflection, and how all of us as college students, I'm a freshman, so how all of us can use that in our first semester, I guess, and help benefit the last 3.5 semesters here. So I don't know if you have anything else about that, like questions you ask ourselves or methods or anything.
Well, there are a lot of people in the room I know who can contribute. I'm going to take a very brief answer and other people respond as well. One thing, obviously, is to do what your school did, which is make it part of the structure, which is rare still. The other is what my daughter did, which is to go against the structure and carve it out on your own, which ironically ends up fulfilling goals of the institution, which is taking to higher learning. There are some tricks. One of them that I learned slowly in my education, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, which is very competitive. I came from a very poor educational background, not economical, but it wasn't a very good high school. And I remember my freshman year, we were reading Plato and Socrates, and everybody in the class had already read them. I was reading them for the first time, so we would be reading like the Republic, and I would have to read 5 books in order to understand the book I was reading. So I worked 24/7. I did really well, but it was mind-bogglingly difficult. Within a year or two, I figured out, once I got a basic sort of level of knowledge, that you didn't really need always to read every word in every assignment. If the assignment was unbearably long, that you could do what every professional in the world learns to do, which is to skim read. And I don't say that lightly in the sense of not taking it seriously, but if you've got 4 assignments for 300-page books in 1 week and you can't do it, you have to develop the skill of finding the main idea in the book, finding the chapters that are irrelevant or redundant, and then sometimes reading 1 or 2 really critical pages and going for a walk is more useful than reading 30 pages and thinking that because you read more, you learned more. So again, it's all about taking control, keeping keeping journals. You know, it's one of the oldest mechanisms in the world. I look back at the journals I kept when I went to Russia in 1988, and I'm astounded at what I thought I knew. You know, I was just wrong most of the time, as most tourists were at that place at that time. It was all very gimmicky, showy, good impression of a tourist place. But the fact that I wrote down my impressions and I can look at them now allows me to understand who I was and be a tourist in a society that was opening. And that helped me to be a better NGO operative in China, because I didn't want to make the same mistakes over again. I try to share those experiences with my students. And just talking with your peers, sitting down. Maybe most importantly, talking with people that you wouldn't necessarily choose to talk with, who don't come from the same perspective. So if you're an American and you're in China, you know, talk to the Chinese roommate who has a set of values that kind of irritate you and try to understand where they come from. And if you're Chinese, you know, talk to the Anglo from the West and try to understand the bizarre perspective they're bringing to China, and get to a comfort zone where you can be really honest with one another and laugh at one another and say, I'm really glad you said that. We know you think that. Let's talk about that. That's really fun. Those are the best conversations I've ever had with friends who just burst out laughing and say, oh, you're being an American again, you know? And I can laugh at myself. You have to get distance. What about the rest of you? That's a really important question.
How do you start this relationship as early as freshman year, like with people thinking about these things and then having them follow through with it? Because I graduated UVM in May, and I was an international environmental studies teaching assistant for the last 2 years. I'd say like none of the 60 students I had ever really were thinking about this, and it was an international class, and like we talked about that. We'd bring in people from groups that were like showing their programs about international studies, and kids would get excited about it for like 2 minutes, and then they just kind of forget. So like, how do you like get that slow build if people are so like their attention is so?
Well, part of the answer is not a very satisfying answer, which is you have to work with the students you have. If you have students who are flowing from enthusiasm to another, you know, sometimes it's hard to get them to land long enough to, you know, actually engage. There's not much you can do about that. I'm not saying it's hopeless, but that's a hard case. But I think we can build institutional structures that encourage students to start early and enable students who want to start early. And I did that with China. I created something called the China Working Group. I did this with Tiffany and Nan Jengs-Jay from Environmental Studies here, because my organization is environmental. For about 5 or 6 years, we've met several times a year as a group and said, okay, those of you who are planning on going to China at some point, you know, next spring, next year, 3 years from now, let's share experiences about what's working and what isn't. And actually, working on, as John mentioned, a consulting report with the college, which is creating a new model specifically for China that I'm hoping will actually require students to become involved with a planning group that has people that have China expertise who would vet research projects and internships long before students go to China. In other words, if you want to get funding to do an internship or a research project in China, don't send Randy or Tiffany or Lisa or somebody, you know, an email a month before you're going saying, what are my options? You know, get on board with the planning process a year or two in advance. Plan right, get feedback from people who have substantive knowledge, expertise in the area so that we can develop a proposal that is realistic. And then you launch the student into the real world. And as I say, don't cut them loose. You know, you continue to supervise them. But I'm a big believer in the ability of institutional structures to enable, not necessarily to encumber and limit, but to enable students. There's nothing wrong with students who in their junior year decide they're going to change career paths, and we have to be prepared to deal with them and do last minute changes. But the majority of students actually have a fairly good idea of what they want to do. They're going to go and study abroad at school. They're going to be there. They want to do an internship. There's no reason they can't start planning, you know, for that a year or a year and a half in advance. And we We have to hold them accountable if they don't do that. Create incentives.
I would just add, the more you can give the students ownership, even if it's in small bits as they are working through something, the more it'll become their thing and not somebody else talking at or with them. So if you're looking at international projects, but you're in a classroom and you're going to be in Vermont for the semester, for the year, or whatever, maybe there are projects that relate to what you're talking about internationally, but that are happening right here that they could experiment with, and then you or others' roles can help project how that relates to what they'll be doing. Or one of the things I've always wished that we could do more of at Middlebury is we have so many students go abroad, and we have a big alternative break trip program. I'd love to have sophomore year immersion experiences where they go to New York City and go to Chinatown there and experience what it's like, or go to Boston and we've had students work in the Latino community, and having seniors who have come back from their experience abroad lead those trips with younger students so that they get that taste of it and develop awareness before they go abroad, but in a realistic kind of context, given time and money and things like that. So I don't know if that helps at all, or if you're already trying to do that, but I just think if we can give them pieces, and again, I just think the hands-on learning where it becomes their own is what gets their attention and lengthens the attention span.
Debbie really nailed it when she's alluding to peer mentoring. It's a really effective tool. It's an underutilized tool. I think you're starting to use it. We can really begin to use it more, EIA and generally across campus. But I still think it's terribly underutilized. And the problem is that professors in particular, because they have expertise, think they have all the answers. But sometimes they don't even know how to talk to students at the level of where students are professionally and personally. It's much easier sometimes for a student to say, oh yeah, I went through that last year. I really didn't know if I wanted to do a senior thesis or not. These are the implications of doing it. This is the time frame in which it needs to be planned. Students can really be enormously valuable assets for one another.
I also wonder if along those veins, if you're studying something globally or internationally, if you actually have students who are peers to the students in your classroom who are from those places, so it's their issue rather than an issue that's on the other side of the globe, all of a sudden it's my friend whomever that lives in this country and is having these issues. I think of Zahina and the Maldives and how her experience and her passion became others' experiences and others' passions just because she brought it to life so much instead of it just being an intellectual exercise that they had no attachment to. So at a school like UVM, maybe there are students whose stories you could build in and bring into the classroom that relate to whatever the geographic area you're studying in. And then if there are connections of students who know those people, it just might bring it alive in a slightly different way.
I want to throw out one thought, and maybe this picks up on something that I think a lot of us are trying to get a hold of. At a meeting with Shirley Hayato, I guess it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were just chatting about the trajectory of students here and thinking about all the tools you have at your disposal. I'm sure I brought up some detail. And I began to mention something, Randy, that you had thrown out maybe 2 months ago, which I love, which is the idea of sort of individual learning goals. And let me summarize it. This is how I understood it. So if you're, let's say you're a student who has a study abroad opportunity coming, as part of that, it may be application. You would actually sit down with your advisor or somebody in your office, Tiffany, somebody in our office, and say, all right, if if you were able to go overseas, what do you hope for? And maybe one person says, I want to develop my leadership skills. Another says, I want to learn to apply cost-benefit analysis. Another says, I want to just bear witness to the life of women in developing countries, whatever it is. And then that almost literally becomes a contract, not so much one that threatens or binds, but rather is an opening to come back. It's almost like kind of a public version of the journal you're talking about. So then they return, they sit down with that same person, or even conceivably somebody else, and say, what happened there? So I like that as sort of a mechanism. In the conversation with Shirley, she mentioned that, I believe it was University of Miami, has an electronic portfolio. Have you all heard about this? And this idea, as she explained it to me, is your first year at a place like Middlebury, you show up and you're literally given kind of a space online to begin to dump things you care about and develop your goals, so it becomes your own kind of repository for contracts like that, for reflections. And what they start to do, this picks up so perfectly with your long tail, is that it keeps going as you graduate. So you hold on to that. So you can see ideally how it could be. So I think maybe among our institutions, the EIA, MCSE, maybe bringing Rowan, maybe that's a conversation worth having. At least I think that can come out of some of the meetings you're pulling together along these lines. The second thing I would just simply say about your school experience and what we faculty can do, and this is starting to sound like a cliche around here, but I actually say it again because it's going to be possible, and it is to slow down. I mean, you all should demand of your professors that we don't assign as much as we do. You should demand of the first-year seminar professors that they have time for contemplative pedagogy. Pass-fail was a good step, but it's not enough. I recently had a meeting with Ron, and he revealed among two very, very talented cohorts of Middlebury students, including the very top students, they say there's too much work. There's just too much to do, and we don't learn. And that's not true every day. We know this is a great place, but I think that I think there's enough people on this campus now who understand that we need to be in positions of power that we could do that. But Ron is very attuned to what students want, more than any other constituency, actually. And if students come to him with some productive ideas on this, based on your experience, say, with reflection in your high school, he'll be all ears. Finally, I have to say, I'm so pleased that for our center, we sort of stumbled into 4 verbs. And so we say that at the center, students they learn how to reflect, connect, analyze, and engage. And we really are putting emphasis on the first 2. At Middlebury, you're going to learn how to analyze, and you'll learn how to engage. But you're confirming to me that those first 2 may be the most important. So that's a lot. Those are just some thoughts.
I wanted to just go back to your question about reflection, just because there's a couple of easy tools that we can use. And one is sort of the what, so what, now what. Just what is it that you've been doing, and so what is the impact of that? What does that mean for you? What's the importance of it? And then the now what are you going to do with that now? That's something that we use in AmeriCorps programs and some of our civic engagement programs. And then another also goes back to the journaling, but one faculty member who traveled nationally and did a lot of consulting work used an approach which might sound kind of juvenile in some ways, and I don't mean it to be disrespectful, but he just found that it literally helped. And as he was having students reflect about their work, he would suggest, and he had some artistic background, so maybe there was a connection there. But in one font, they would say what they did, because so much of the process that you go through is in part you tell somebody all of the things that you did. You don't necessarily make sense of them, but you repeat that. And then then you would have them change font, and then in the next font say how they felt about what they did, because that's another part of that process, is all of the personal feelings that it elicits. And then in a third font, it would be, so what did I learn as a result, and what do I want to do with that? And just that process, I think, of changing the funds, you may or may not need to do it, but it's just a sort of mental reminder or help to transition from one piece to the next. So I don't know if that helps at all.
Okay. I always like to have things with the earlier anything.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What do you think Middlebury could do to identify students like Winston who have had significant abroad experiences or experiences within the U.S. before coming to Middlebury to make sure that the learning curve doesn't go down during the freshman year and before they start doing their first official Middlebury-sponsored internship or project?
Well, one of the things I proposed to Michael Geisler and Jeff Gason, who are the two people who are, I guess, the primary chief administrators in charge of our study abroad, is that we stop making a radical division between behaviors that are expected of students abroad and behaviors that are acceptable on campus. And what I mean by that is that we send students to China where they're supposed to sit down and be open and receptive to engage in Chinese, but that's usually like one semester, maybe a summer. They spend the other 3.5 years here having dinner every night with their other international student colleagues or Japanese friends or WASP New England private school friends, and they don't practice any of the skills of international engagement while they're here that we're expecting them to engage in abroad. So I think what we need to do is create a campus climate from literally the day you hit campus as a freshman, which treats Middlebury not as a bubble, but as an international community where the rules of engagement for being abroad apply here. So you go to the cafeteria, don't sit down with the comfortable people you'd be comfortable sitting with. Sit down with people from another culture, another gender, another race, and get involved. And I would hope that would begin to level the playing field, because one of the saddest things I've encountered here is the degree of encapsulation that occurs for international students who come and hang out with other internationals, usually from their own language group and sometimes from their own country. In the case of China, which I know best, it took me 5 years, I'm embarrassed to say, but it's true, it took me 5 years for students here to help me understand that when we talk about Chinese students in Middlebury, we're talking about students from mainland China, talking about American-born Chinese, American-born Taiwanese students, all these different constituencies, all of whom have radically different identities and interests and needs and view one another as competitors with the Anglos who are being trained to go back to China and compete with them in the job market. So, if we recognize the diversity that we have on campus and begin to treat this as your first international experience, then you don't have to go abroad to start planning to engage internationally. You can start doing it right here, right now. And I think international students have to take more responsibility for being proactive doing that, not view themselves as excluded or neglected. I think they have to take more risks engaging students. Chinese students need to develop comfort speaking up in public on issues that involve China. The Dalai Lama is coming. I bet there's not going to be a debate on campus. I hope I'm wrong, but I bet there's not going to be a debate or a discussion openly about how the Chinese students feel about the Dalai Lama coming. I'll just give you an example. My friend in Beijing, that I developed an enormous amount of trust with, sat down with me for one of our long midnight discussions, and he brought up the Dalai Lama. I was working with Stephen Rockefeller at the time, who originally brought the Dalai Lama here, good friend of the Dalai Lama's, and he said, he's a CIA stooge. And I said, oh God, here goes the Chinese Lama. He was funded by the CIA and all this. And I said, okay, Munchie, I'll go and see if there's any factual basis to this. So I went online, I trained story, I find 2 books. Guess what? The Dalai Lama was the first CIA covert operation. The first CIA operative who ever died in action was the group that helped the Dalai Lama to get out as a child. The Dalai Lama admits in public, these are like Harvard publications, he admits in public that being on the payroll of the CIA in 1956. So it's like, oh my God, I didn't know this. My parents were Chinese friends, and I'm paranoid. Thank God I listened and went and did research. Now I understand why the Chinese government has concerns. I don't understand and support their actions, but I understand that they have information that gives them concerns. And wouldn't it be nice if when the Dalai Lama comes here, we could have that kind of discussion? Wouldn't it be really interesting to know how Chinese students feel about the Dalai Lama coming to campus? You know, how's it going to impact their lives? How is it going to impact their lives when they go home and people say, Dalai Lama was there, did you go and see him? So we have to develop comfort zones and spaces, times and places to reflect. And part of the reflection is looking at our selves and moments of discomfort and finding out ways of sharing, you know, that discomfort openly with others so that we can grow together. That's the real learning that happens. Am I helping to answer your question?
Yes.
That reminds me too, John, I don't know if you've ever played with this as a pedagogy, but we've, from time to time in a variety of aspects, used deliberative dialogue.
Yes, that's good.
And part of the point of deliberative dialogue is to make sure that there are at least 3 points of view, so that it's not a debate and sort of one person is right or one person is wrong, but instead to recognize that there are multiple perspectives, and hopefully at the end of that, you learn to at least appreciate aspects of the multiple perspectives, so that it's not just putting one student against another or one community member against another, but recognizing that there really are multiple ways of looking at things, and to tease apart what are there aspects that might resonate with you that you didn't think about before, or are there ways to look at something from a slightly broader approach to appreciate the complexity of something.
Literally final last minute. Anybody want to make that comment or have?
I'll ask you a quick one. Are you saying, coming back to the Dalai Lama, I'm not sure, were you implying in the sense that Chinese students, regardless of what part of China they know how they come there, somehow they've been told by the Chinese government there's this link with the CIA and the Dalai Lama?
Well, they've been told that.
In other words, this is something that is sort of taught at school.
Oh, it is widely publicized in China that the Dalai Lama, had a CIA connection. But my point was, it's historically true.
Yeah, I understand that. But what I haven't seen it over here in the United States, I mean, this is me and the first. Has anybody else ever heard that? And so they're saying they're teaching something to their students that we've never heard.
And we dismiss it as brainwashing because it reflects negatively on someone we adore. I mean,
It doesn't fit our narrative.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. He's a marvelous, incredible man.
Yeah.
He's like Martin Luther King and George Washington and Jefferson, the slave owner. He's an imperfect person like all of us,
Yeah.
and we never understand this until we listen to our critics and the people who challenge our deeply held assumptions and beliefs. That's when real learning happens.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go to China to have that discussion. You could have it here, but I don't think we're as prepared to have it here, ironically, as we are in China, which is the worst place to have this particular discussion. Because nobody in China would want to talk about this in China.
Really, is there anything that you would encourage students to help empower them of what they might ask for or seek out in terms of this? In terms of influencing Middlebury education in one towards the long tails of the learning curve as opposed to how do we change the system? How do we deepen the impact?
My 1 minute answer is that I'm in the first draft of this China Initiative Task Force that I've been commissioned to do. So, it was going pretty well, so I went to some headwinds from the Chinese department unexpectedly recently. And I'm realizing that we've got the Monterey Middlebury feud is surfacing again in different perspectives, the professional and the liberal arts approach. And the way I see of reconciling is something that I've actually learned from you, John, which is I think we need to get students as stakeholders to the table talking about this and say, hey, look, you're planning our future for us. Let us tell you what worked. So when Lila comes here next week, we've had this discussion about the Chinese department, her experience. She has big pluses and big negatives. I want to ask her, I said, Lila, would you be willing to go on record and not be brought back as the poster child who succeeded because you became the co-director, but talk about how hard it was locking horns in the Chinese department, how you left here furious. 2 years later, loved the education you got, finally put it together, 12 years out. Now what do you think? And if you could do it all over again and help us design it, because we are actually designing it. What I hope, and what Ron Sumer and Tim Spears hopes will be, a totally different kind of model for China. And if we can get it to work better for students in China, and apropos of Ron's message, make this a value-adding curve, not just a learning curve, then we have a breakthrough for Middlebury as an institution. You guarantee Middlebury's future. But I don't think we can do it with students. So the answer is get students involved as stakeholders, and then they're going to have to speak up. And probably sometimes speak up in front of some of their current professors and say things that they probably haven't dared to say before. Not that it's all criticism, but they have to feel comfortable saying, that just doesn't work. We can learn from it.
A very positive thing went to the faculty this morning. Email from one of our EAC colleagues, and I can't quite believe this is happening. We're going to start a dialogue with the faculty. What is the liberal arts? What does it mean to you? And all of us should be involved in that. I mean, students, staff, everybody. And that's not just going back to basics. It's a conversation you want to turn to every once in a while, actively. And it's, my sense is the faculty is trying. There's so many changes happening now. There's a letter, still trying to figure out an array. There's a lot moving. There's a lot of flux, and I'm just so happy that we're just going to go and ask ourselves. I think that is a very positive step. To make your point, hopefully that's going to be a conversation that includes all of us.
I would just conclude by saying, I'm not saying this to be overly polite, but I want to thank all of you who are here, because I've been involved with many of you for a decade or more in the dialogue, and there are times we have met and sympathized. There are times we've met and disagreed and wondering, why the heck is he or she saying that? I don't get it. Then a year later, coming back and saying, hey, you were right. We really co-evolved, and I think we still are. In terms of our own learning, we're still climbing the learning curve. We have a long way to go. And I think if we recognize that, that'll be, instead of thinking we have the answers, I think we can get to where we want to get. I often get criticized by my friends who are less affluent, less privileged, for having affiliation with Middlebury. It's an unreal place. It's the bubble, as my daughter used to say. And I keep saying, I'm here because this place has the resources to do it right. And I lived through the Cold War. And I know how close we came to not getting through the Cold War. And that's why my wife and I founded ECOLOGIA. And I don't want to repeat the Cold War with China. So this isn't just a learning curve about our portfolios. I mean, not to be overly dramatic, it's not just about climate change. It's about human survival. If this place, with these resources, intellectual and monetary, can't train people to be world leaders and to listen to one another and ourselves inside, then it isn't going to happen anywhere. So I really think we have, as Stephen Rockefeller wrote into the Earth Charter, with enormous wealth and resources comes added responsibility. The responsibility here is enormous, really important. That's why I moved up here.